Now we ask what happens when a promisor breaches her contractual obligations. What remedies are available for breach? In this screencast lecture, I'll introduce the basic categories of monetary damages. As you read, the ordinary remedy for a breach of contract is expectation damages. First, notice that damage doctrines are, at least nominally, default rules. In Globe Refining, for example, Justice Holmes observes that parties commonly say little or nothing about breach. Damage rules thus fill a gap left when the parties themselves don't specify what happens in the event of a breach. I sincerely hope that Holmes's prescription for gap filling seemed quite familiar to you. He says that courts should be guided by what the parties probably would have said if they'd spoken about the matter. A man's liability for damages should be, quote, on terms which it fairly may be presumed he would have assented to if they'd been presented to his mind. As you surely recognized when you read it, this approach is nothing more or less than the hypothetical bargain analysis that we've seen repeatedly throughout the course. Globe Refining also teaches us that one common measure of expectation damages is the difference between the contract price and the market price at the time for delivery. Restatement Section 347B and UCC Section 2715 add to this price differential recovery for any incidental and consequential damages. The relevant sections include Section 2711, which provides for cover, or remedies under 2713. We learn in Section 2712 what cover means. It's a transaction in which the promisee obtains substitute performance. If the promisee chooses not to obtain cover, then he's left with the remedies under Section 2713. Section 2713 defines those remedies as the difference between the market and contract price plus incidental and consequential damages. It's convenient to think of this measure of damages as being recovery for hypothetical cover. What would it have cost to cover once the promisee learned about the breach? Finally, Section 2715 defines incidental and consequential damages. This section also limits recovery of these losses. First, the seller must have had reason to know of them. This restriction we'll call the foreseeability limitation. And they could not reasonably be prevented by cover or otherwise. This limitation is known as avoidability or mitigation. The organizing principle here is to put the buyer in the position he would have been in had the contract been performed, but without incurring any unnecessary expense. That's why we also require the buyer to behave reasonably in avoiding losses. We give the buyer enough to cover at no additional cost over the contract price, but we also enlist the buyer's help in avoiding losses from the breach. Finally, let me also distinguish among the three interests protected by contract damages. We focus to this point on the promisee's expectation interest. The idea here is to put the promisee in as good a position as she would have been in had the contract been performed. When it's too difficult to measure the expectation interest reliably, courts sometimes protect instead the promisee's reliance interest. In this case, we use money damages to restore the promisee to the position she would have been in if the parties never made the contract. Courts taking this approach tend to focus on the promisee's out-of-pocket costs. They rarely allow recovery as reliance damages for what economists call opportunity costs. That is, the missed opportunity to contract with someone else for the same performance. Finally, damages protecting the restitution interest allow the promisee to recover any benefits she's conferred on the breaching promisor. Courts use restitutionary recovery most commonly when they order the breaching party to return any deposit paid by the promisee. Thanks for listening.